The final part of the program will be introducing the panel, and each panelist will have an opportunity to question either speaker, and we're going to play it by ear whether a panelist can have two questions to one speaker. If the first one is very short, the answer will be in the affirmative. One point before I introduce the panelists, Michael Davies has spoken about Father Kenneth Baker, who's the editor for many years of the Homiletic and Pastoral Review. Father Baker's a Jesuit in good standing. The two most important articles I've ever read in that journal were by an anonymous parish priest. He entitled the first article, "The Plight of the Papist Priest," and then many years later, 7 years later, he wrote a follow-up called "The Plight of the Papist Priest #2." I happen to know the identity of this man. He's absolutely reliable and instructed and so on. If you do nothing else, try to get both plights. I think Keep the Faith should simply read into a tape both plights and ask yourself, is there or is there not a state of emergency in the church? I mean, if you're talking about planet Earth, the answer is yes. I don't know if the group was given a schedule of events, but the panel consists of Thomas Case, who writes for Fidelity magazine very often, has written certain controversial articles, including the one on the Society of Pius X. James Sullivan, I have here William Sullivan, but Jim Sullivan is executive director of Catholics United for the Faith. Its headquarters is in New Rochelle. I don't know where Thomas Case was educated, but I believe Jim Sullivan went to a Jesuit college, which makes him suspect, but he went to Fairfield University. And the third panelist is Christopher Ferrara, who also went to a Jesuit college, and even worse, to a Jesuit law school. He went to Fordham. So this will balance off the iniquity. And I'm going to ask those gentlemen to sit here. We hope the mic works. This one mic will be shared by all three people, or perhaps someone can come up here. But the sense of this is these three panelists who have some expertise in their field are going to ask each of these speakers questions and expect a short answer. They might follow up with one more question, and after maybe a half hour of this, we'll have questions from the floor. Gentlemen? Right, just sit in the center. Mr. Case, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Ferrara. So, you want to start with James? Yeah. James Sullivan of Catholics United for the Faith. You ask the question, or address it. And where's Michael Jones? Oh, good. And Michael Davies, would you sit over here too so you can get to the... I am now out of it unless there is a riot.
I should make a correction. I'm only the vice president of Catholics United for the Faith and not the executive director. I may have been the executive director at one time, but after I missed my first deadline for lay witness, I was promptly demoted. I went to Holy Cross and not to Fairfield, which isn't saying anything good about me, except that I live in Fairfield and there are Fairfield U kids that live around me, and Catholic higher education is in deep trouble by the hot tubs and the... but anyway, I do have a question for Mr. Davies, and it concerns his mentioning early... Louder? I have a question for Mr. Davies.
We're not demoting Mary. This is not Mary.
A question for Mr. Davies. Early in your presentation, you used the phrase, the continuity of the church. That is, that the continuity of the church was in question. And this this, it seems to me, is a very serious point and may actually underlie the whole Lefebvre phenomenon. And that is that a group of people took it upon themselves to make that determination that the church was in discontinuity with its past. And my question is this. In the final protocol involving Cardinal Ratzinger, in the great expectation that Archbishop Lefebvre would be brought back into full communion with the church, Cardinal Ratzinger said to Archbishop Lefebvre that if you have any questions regarding dignitatis humanae, questions of religious freedom, questions that pertain to the sacred liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, then as a bishop in the church, you as a lone bishop, you as a bishop isolated in a cone, you do not make that determination on those questions alone, but instead you refer those questions to the teaching magisterium. The teaching magisterium, the ongoing teaching magisterium, Pope and bishops in union with him. And to my knowledge, Archbishop Lefebvre did not refer his questions to the teaching magisterium, did not refer his questions to Pope John Paul II or Cardinal Ratzinger. And therefore, my question to Mr. Davies is, if in fact Archbishop Lefebvre did not do this, are we not then left with the conclusion that he preferred to remain outside of the church, to have a certain ne plus ultra position, and to not finally conform, becoming in a sense a kind of icon unto himself, and in fact a child of the electronic age?
Oh. First thing I'm going to say there is he did not prefer to remain outside the church because he never was outside the church. I presume you agree that he was still a bishop of the Catholic Church until the consecrations. Do you agree with that? Well, you have to agree with it because the admonition sent to him by Cardinal Gantin said that if you carry out these consecrations, you will harm the Catholic Church, of which you are a bishop. And so he was obviously a bishop until the consecrations. So how on earth he could remain outside the church when he was inside the church, that's a mystery to me. And again, you're presuming that in the debate today it's been proved that he was schismatic. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, I've shown very convincingly that he wasn't schismatic. But leave that aside. Yes, I agree completely that the only person, well, not the only person, the only institution, which is the Magisterium of the Church, is the only institution that can give a final answer to questions of faith and morals. That's why in my book on religious liberty, which some of you might have read, I said I do not claim that Dignitatis Humanae, that's the Vatican II document on religious liberty, I said I do not claim that it contradicts the previous magisterium. What I say is I cannot see how it can be reconciled with it, which I cannot, which is a statement of fact. And I invited the magisterium to show me how it can be reconciled. And I know that it's been put into the hands of Cardinal Ratzinger. So on that point, I agree completely with Mr. Sullivan. That is the only way that you can solve any matter of faith or doctrines. Ultimately, the magisterium must decide. But I don't know what these questions are that the Archbishop didn't submit. They did submit their position on religious liberty to the Holy Office. Cardinal Ratzinger has read it. They sent in a big dossier saying why they thought the document on religious liberty couldn't be reconciled with the previous teaching, and submitted it. So I don't think there's a case where he didn't do what you said. But if you want to come back at me on that, you're welcome to do so.
Would Dr. Jones want to comment on Davies' answer? Yeah.
One of the things that I did not mention before was the fact that Mr. Davies keeps quoting experts. He said here at one point...
Just because I'm humble.
He said here at one point that He had three unnamed three canon lawyers that he consulted, and they all agreed with his position. He didn't tell us who they were, but the thing that strikes me here is when he quotes these documents, he quotes the document from the Pope, and it says, I forget exactly what it said, but it was only something like, it mentioned excommunication. He's talking here as if we're doing exegesis of some fragment of some text that was discovered in a scroll in a cave somewhere. The same Pope that mentioned excommunication there, and I quoted it in my talk, it just seems to have slipped through the cracks here. That same quote mentioned that he was in schism and that it was a schismatic act. He's talking as if we've lost communication somehow, and we have to scrutinize these little fragments, these little esoteric fragments. Cardinal Ratzinger, does Mr. Davies, he quotes Cardinal Ratzinger about a case in Honolulu. Well, great. Cardinal Ratzinger said something about a case in Honolulu. But what does Cardinal Ratzinger feel about Archbishop Lefebvre? Does he think he's in schism? Of course he does. Of course he does. We're spinning one argument out of another. The point that I would like to make here, though, is the point that I made in my original thing. Schism is not something that happens like that when the jury delivers its verdict and suddenly everybody jumps up and, hey, Gotti got off. His lawyers did it. Schism suffused the society. That's what I'm saying. Schism suffuses, it permeates, it grew. Do you know it's an organic thing, if you want to talk about that way? Right? It suffused the society. And the point that I tried to make as well is that it suffused the writings of Michael Davies. He tries to skip over this point. Well, is Archbishop Weakland tainted by communion with the Pope? He doesn't want to answer that question.
It's the other way around, isn't it?
Is the Pope tainted? I have jet lag. I came up from Atlantic City today. I've got jet lag. Is the Pope tainted by communion with Archbishop Weakland? If you feel that he is, that's a schismatic attitude, because there were many other evil people in the church throughout its history, and the church survived all of them. And it's impossible for the church not to survive those people, because Christ promised that. Thank you.
Can I respond to that? No. Yes, we'll start here.
Mr. Thomas Case will now
Stop
ask
here.
a question.
You can't argue with Bill.
I didn't know what the setup for this thing would be, so it's kind of a shock to me that I'm on some panel here. Looks like it's stacked against Mr. Davies, but there's no one beside. Be that as it may,
Right into the mic.
be that as it may, Mr. Davies writes in an article, who is Schismatic Part 2, in the Angelus of December 1990. He says that the consecration of a bishop without a papal mandate is not an intrinsically schismatic act. And this on the grounds that if it were, it would always carry the penalty of excommunication. But in the 1917 Code of Canon Law, it only carries the penalty of suspension. My answer, or my question about that is, Lefebvre's consecrations were not only without a papal mandate, but directly in the face of a papal prohibition of the act. Lefebvre wasn't off in some jungle in Laos under the gun to consecrate bishops for a national people's church, but in free and friendly Switzerland, nose to nose with the Holy Office. Cardinal Ratzinger said, "You will not consecrate a bishop on your own authority." Bishop Lefebvre said, "I will." This was direct, public, scandalous, face-to-face refusal of submission. Canon 751 defines schism as a refusal of submission to Roman pontiff or of communion with the members of the church subject to him. Furthermore, the Lefebvre fraternity has been under suspension since the mid-1970s. Before and after that suspension, always mounting the criticism of Rome, and after that suspension, continuing to operate in seminaries and missions outside of Roman jurisdictions. it was already in a quasi-separated disobedient status. To ensure the perpetuation of that separate organization after the death of Lefebvre, new bishops were needed. It was not only a matter of consecrating a bishop or bishops without a papal mandate. It was consecrating bishops for an organization already refusing the jurisdiction of the Holy See. At that point, a semi-schismatic development becomes formally schismatic. It fulfills the canonical definition of schism as being the refusal of submission to the Pope or communion with the members of the Church united to him. Which is why the excommunication was on the basis of both canons 1364 and 1382. That is, for schism, and in this context, the schismatic act of consecrating bishops for an already suspended organization.
No, you're losing me, I'm afraid.
Let's go just a little bit. I didn't know the format,
Yeah.
so I just want to make a little short statement.
So perhaps I'm getting Sinov, I can't quite follow. What could you put that in the form of a question? I can answer.
Well, I'm not quite playing by the rules because I didn't know what I was going to get into until I got here. I thought I would have something that I should say. So it might take about 5 more minutes to just read that as a general question to you. Are you going to answer? Is that okay?
Well, you have to ask Bill. He's the boss.
What was the question from Mr. Case?
Yes. No. Mr. Case wants to read it for another 5 minutes.
Well, now let me. It seems to me you are calling Michael to account. Michael seems not to have taken so seriously these canon prohibitions, and you are insisting that he address the question more directly. And you have noted it's not simply, Michael had said there's nothing intrinsically schismatic about consecrating a bishop. You added the evidence, which no one controversed, that there was a direct notice from Ratzinger and ultimately from the Pope that Lefebvre not consecrate these. He willfully disobeyed, and it seems to me you consider this a formally schismatic act which climaxes this saturation or permeation that Dr. Jones had spoken of before, and it seems to me you want Michael to defend himself in the face of this new articulation. Is that in any way accurate?
Good enough.
Okay.
Right. Yes, right. But the first point, I want to come back to this business about whether consecrating a bishop without a mandate from the Pope is intrinsically schismatic. We've got this code of canon law that was revised. It came to us with the authority of the Pope, recommended by the Pope. The Pope says this is the law of the Church, which I agree with. It's got a section on acts that are schismatic. If consecrating a bishop without a papal mandate is schismatic, then it would be in that section. I can't see what the problem is here. As I've said, the Pope has absolute authority. He could say today, consecrating a bishop without a papal mandate from this moment on is schismatic, and in future editions of the Code of Canon Law it will go there. But you can't suddenly change an offence that isn't schismatic into one that is schismatic. Now, I agree with you, he did disobey the Pope. And that all comes down again to what I was saying about a case of necessity. If a case of necessity exists in the Church, then he was justified even in disobeying this strict command of the Pope in order to preserve the continuity of the Church. Now, one little thing I'd better make absolutely clear, it was a rather good point made by Mr. Sullivan. Obviously, I'm not suggesting for one moment the Catholic Church is going to disappear. That would be heresy. The Catholic Church will exist until the second coming as a visible, hierarchically governed body of Catholics in communion with the Pope. But as Father Henri Bruckberger said, that could end up with 3 or 4 Catholics in a dungeon with the Pope. But that would still constitute the Catholic Church. The only thing we know when the second coming comes, there will be a Pope and there will be, I presume, at least one Catholic in communion with him. but the promise of our Lord that he will be with his church always doesn't apply to the church in any particular country. The whole of North Africa in the time of St. Augustine, that was really the center of the church, even more than Italy. And now there's not a Catholic left there now. It's totally Muslim. The Scandinavian countries were all Catholic. The Catholic Church in the United States isn't Catholic anymore. 95% of Catholics don't follow the Catholic moral teaching. There was an article, I think, in last week's Wanderer from one diocese where they've done a survey. Practically, Catholicism in your country and my country and Canada and Holland is virtually dead. It's gone past the point of no return on an institutional level. You've got valiant fighters like Dr. Jones, who's doing a wonderful job at attacking modernism. I applaud him for it. And we've got, I would say you've got you now have the Society of St. Peter, who are in communion, definitely in communion with the Pope. Nobody can argue with that. You've got the new Institute of Christ the King. Dr. Mara and I, when we were in Italy this year at Lake Garda, we had some fine young priests from that fraternity. One came and acted as chaplain. We've got indult masses, some of them wonderful congregations. I'm going to give a talk in Washington at the church there, St. Mary's. They've got a wonderful congregation, I think about 400, with a lot of very young people. But what I want to say about that is every one of these positive things that we can see is due to one man only, and that's Archbishop Lefebvre. Why? We were told for years and years and years, people who want the Tridentine Mass are we're rebels, we're living in a time warp. Then all of a sudden, when Archbishop Lefebvre consecrated those bishops, they became legitimate aspirations. And the Pope said all the bishops must respond to our legitimate aspirations and let us have the Tridentine Mass. Why was that done? That was done just to get people away from the Pius X chapels. So...
Let Dr. Jones comment on that.
A little while ago, Mr. Davis was criticizing me for excommunicating him.
I didn't criticize. I just mentioned it en passant.
Did you congratulate me for
I'm not complaining.
And yet here we have the same sort of thing, the same sort of attitude. He's giving us the list of the good guys, the real Catholics. This is the schismatic attitude I'm talking about. That we have the right to pass judgment on who is a legitimate Catholic and who is not a legitimate Catholic. But yet at the same time, you know, I love it when people yell at me when I talk. You know, a lot of people like it when people laugh and cheer and applaud, but I love it when people yell at me.
True assurance. And unfeigned grief.
I know I'm doing something right. Again, here we have the Catholic Church. The same thing happened with all these schismatic groups. Do you remember the Society of St. Pius V? Remember that little group?
You were not here to talk about them.
But Mr. Davies criticized them on the radio, okay? They went the whole 9 yards, the trajectory of schism, and the trajectory ends up saying, we, all 187 of us, or something like that, maybe whatever's in this room, are the true Catholic Church, and everybody else is in a state of apostasy. Let me try and bring us back to reality once again. There is a group that has been kicked out of the church, and it is the Society of St. Pius X. And the fact that they are excommunicating everyone else is another sign of schism. I'm not talking about some type of legal, juridical decision. I'm talking about an attitude that pervaded this place. Just before I left to come out here, I got a call from Kansas, and here is Father Scott questioning the validity of all of the sacraments being held in that diocese. What is he trying to say? This is Pius V all over again. It's the whole 9 yards. It's the end of the trajectory. We are the Catholic Church, and you guys, under the Pope, are something else. Remember what the Pope said? we keep coming back to this thing, this exegesis, as if there's no other statement around, okay? Hence, such disobedience, referring to Archbishop Lefebvre, the Pope says, which implies in practice the rejection of the Roman primacy, which is what I was just talking about, constitutes a schismatic act. Now, are we with the Pope or are we not with the Pope?
Christopher Ferrara, by the way, is a lawyer who began this group called the American Association of Catholic Lawyers to try to oppose the ACLU. And Chris now has the opportunity to raise a question to one of the speakers.
Okay. This is for Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, we've seen a liberal technique in action just a moment ago where you say, you pose the question, are we with the Pope or are we against the Pope? That is not the issue. Now, as a Catholic, you know that Catholics deal in precise distinctions. The precise question before us today is whether Archbishop Lefebvre is guilty of schism by the performance of a schismatic act. The only act you've adduced tonight is the consecration of the 4 bishops. Mr. Davies has provided a compelling case that that act in and of itself is not schismatic. He's even provided the opinion of a cardinal and a decision in the Honolulu case which suggests that. You've made some vague references to schism by suffusion and gradual growth, but the canonical warning did not say that you were guilty of schism by suffusion or schism by gradual growth, and you provided no evidence of that anyway. So again, the precise question is, beyond the consecration of the 4 bishops, what is it that Archbishop Lefebvre has done to place him in schism other than the conversion of Northern Africa and the preservation of the whole and entire Catholic faith?
If there were a judge here, he'd say that was a leading question.
It's about time we had one.
Yeah, the Pope.
I based my argument on what I consider the proper understanding of the Code of Canon Law. I don't see that I have to go through that all over again, okay? But the fact is that when it comes to imprecision, I'm glad you brought up imprecision, because I see imprecision all over this thing. First of all, Mr. Davis began by saying that a superior does not, if he gives an order that is immoral, it does not have to be followed. Okay? Well, first of all, where was the immoral order? And then secondly, in the middle of the argument, he changed his terms to unjust. Well, that was not the original term, okay? And thirdly, where was the argument, where was the order that was unjust? There were none of these things. And beyond that, we have the statement of the Pope, which is something different than an opinion, you notice the word that gets used, of the Supreme Court or something like that. We're dealing with a whole different order of reality here. And all I'm trying to do is to make that distinction clear. I'm trying to make the distinction. Okay? We're all Americans. We all feel that the law...
Not me.
We're all Welshmen here.
Yes, we are.
And we all feel...
Yes, we're both Welsh. Welsh descent.
That men are not above the law, but in the church, this man is in reality above the law. If you remember, there was no code of canon law when Peter was given the keys by Jesus Christ. There wasn't a code of canon law until a codified code until 1917. Now, we are faced with this situation of what was going on between who was running the store if there was no code of canon law. I'm saying that when the Pope says it's a schismatic act, it's a schismatic act. It's that simple.
Well, what I'm saying is if Cardinal Lara, who's the head of the Papal Commission for the Interpretation of Canon Law says it's not a schismatic act. I'm saying he knows a little bit more about canon law than Michael Jones, who, although we're both of Welsh descent, and we have a wonderful bond in common through that. I'm afraid I'm going along with Cardinal Lahr, and I'm going along with Cardinal Ratzinger. This Bishop of Honolulu, I hear there are a few dubious things about him. It's, I won't go into, but it's put me off going on a holiday to Honolulu ever, but still. He specifically stated, just by associating with these people, you make yourself schismatic. I won't read it again, because I hope you're all going to buy the tape, and you can hear exactly what he said then. Actually, you can buy a copy of the Angelus outside. I think they've got both the letters in them, so you can see it for yourself. And they said that was not an intrinsically, that is not an act of formal schism. But, so I'm not going to waste any more time arguing about that. It's not consecrating a bishop without a papal mandate is not in the code of canon law under the section concerning schism. That's that. Now, the other point I make, I did not change my argument. The debate's been going on, and I'm sure Dr. Jones has just got slightly muddled. I did not say St. Thomas, well, I said St. Thomas taught that if a superior gives a command that is immoral, you have a duty not to obey it. I did say that. And then I said he also gives another case when a superior gives a command that is unjust. And I've stated very clearly, you have the right to disobey that. You're not obliged to do it. And I even remember, I know it might be jet lagged, but I think I remember saying that you could submit to an unjust command from your superior. I'm sure that that's what I said. So that's a very important difference. Now, I have never said that the Pope ordering Archbishop Lefebvre not to consecrate bishops was an immoral act. Sorry, I didn't express that very clearly. I've never said that if Archbishop Lefebvre had refused to consecrate the bishops, that would have been an immoral act, and the Pope was commanding him to do something immoral. Of course he wasn't. I didn't want him to consecrate these bishops. I wrote a long letter to Archbishop Lefebvre begging him not to do these consecrations. We haven't discussed today whether consecrating these bishops was a prudent act. And this is a completely different matter. I've tried to keep to the subject of the debate tonight, which is purely whether the Society of St. Pius X is in schism. And I don't want to get sidetracked on more anonymous telephone calls from St. Mary's in Kansas. Practically everything written in Mr. Case's article about that was totally untrue. I mean, if he wants it, I've got some documentation in my case, but that would be a side proving this. And this ridiculous thing, like this woman who got her house burnt down. She was in hospital at the time. No, I'm just meaning in a hospital at the time. She was. Well, I won't get into it. Yes, right. No, I won't. No, that's fair enough. We Welshmen are men of our word. So unless Mr. Case wants to start getting into that, we'll try and keep off ad hominem things.
Now, let's start one more round of questions from the panel, then we'll try to open the floor in an orderly way. Maybe we can start with Mr. Case. Would you start first? Are you ready? And please speak right into the mic.
I just want to answer to that idea that my article, the original article that caused all this controversy was a pack of lies. I checked all my sources, double-checked them, called back. When I got denials, I went back to get people who were afraid to talk before, to make themselves public. You can read all about that in the original article. You can read about it in the December of that same year of Fidelity, which has the responses and the replies to the responses. You can read Michael Davies' diatribe against my article. You can read my response to that diatribe. They're all available here. Okay, enough of that.
Right, there's a pamphlet. Yeah, right.
One point.
I just want to make sure. You're talking about a pamphlet costs 50 cents, and it's Thomas Case answer to Michael Davies?
Right.
Right. It's available in the hall. Okay, please, ma'am, the question.
Okay, well, I should say this in the form of a question, but I'll I was talking to a friend of mine who said that this might be a schism in terms of obedience, but it's not a real schism. For a real schism, you need something different from that. You need something deeper. He talked about setting up an altar opposed to the altar of Rome. Now, I asked him, I pinned him down on that. I said, what do you mean? He said, he just repeated himself. But what it seems to mean is that there is some kind of spiritual difference, some kind of spiritual sundering. Okay, I would say that a deep sundering is in fact in place. An altar has been set up in opposition to the altar of Rome. When Marcel Lefebvre says that the Holy See is the seat of the Antichrist, as he did in his public letter of 1987, that is setting up a counter-altar. When Superior General Father Schmidberger says that the Curia is ruled by the Freemasons and the Illuminati, that is setting up a counter-altar. When Lefebvre says that the Masons have taken over Rome, have been put in place by John Paul II, and with whom he agrees, that is setting up a counter-altar. When Bishop Williamson says that there is a Catholic faith which is not the faith of Rome, and prays for a Pope of truth, that is setting up an altar opposing the altar of Rome. So that's a statement, not a question. Just respond. Please respond.
Okay, but Michael?
No, thank you. We've got them right. I'm going to make 2 points. I'm going to make them as briefly as I can here. I said I wasn't going to comment on Mr. Casey St. Mary's article, and as he brought it up, and he says everything he researched is true, and he checks his sources. Very well, here we go. Fear, he wrote a bit about fear. Now, he says, before I say that, I'll just repeat Canon 220. Every Catholic has the right not to have his reputation damaged or to have his privacy violated. This is from Mr. Case's article. St. Mary's is a town driven by fear and controversy. Not too long ago, a woman who had dared to criticize Father Angeles, who's the rector, had an accident and went to hospital. When she returned, she found her house had been burned to the ground. There's no evidence that Father Angeles and his henchmen were responsible, but they took a kind of spiritual credit for it. A woman caught wearing slacks received a letter from the administration saying, anyone who crosses Father Angeles meets with tragedy. A reference to the house burning. This is Mr. Case. This is the message that came from the pulpit and spreads across the town to breed fear and increasingly a kind of desperate rage. Father Angeles sent a response which Mr. Jones very fairly printed, sorry, Dr. Jones. The only house burned in St. Mary since I arrived here was the apartment occupied by my friend Mrs. Eleanor Chavez, our teacher of Spanish. I brought her to St. Mary's and she remains on our staff. You can contact her at the Academy address or telephone during normal business hours. Now, Mr. Case's response was, instead of saying, I'm sorry, I apologize, I made a mistake, this is what he says. In the December 1902 Fidelity, page 6. Mrs. Chavez's apartment burned down while she was in hospital. He's got this thing about her being in hospital. The point I was making in the article was not that Father Angeles or his comrades, they've changed from henchmen to comrades. Now, I don't know, it's like his articles are articles, mine are diatribes, but never mind. Father Angeles or his comrades were guilty of arson. I'm sure that Mr. Flowers is probably lucky he didn't say that. But that ever since that incident, people are afraid that their homes will be burned down if they dare go against the Angeles regime. The fear is fed by threatening letters, like the one written to an ostracized family by an Angeles supporter, to wit, and for your own sake, take a lesson from recent history. Mrs. Chavez refused to live on campus as father wished her. Her home burned down with all her possessions. Well, actually, I thought, let's check up on this. So I wrote to Mrs. Chavez. I've got a very nice letter back from her. Dear Mr. Davis, Fidelity magazine in its October 1992 issue published an article of Mr. Thomas Case about the Society of St. Pius X. On page 40, it is affirmed that a woman who had dared to criticize Father Angeles had an accident and went to hospital. When she returned, she found her house had been burned to the ground. There is no evidence that Father Angeles and his henchmen were responsible, but they take a kind of spiritual credit for it. Let me make some comments. 1. I have never been in hospital, and I thank God for my good health. 2. On August the 31st, 1990, my apartment in St Mary's caught fire during the early morning while my daughter Talia, my Siamese cat Pepita, and myself were sound asleep inside the same apartment. At 3 a.m., the street sweeper, Mr. Perry, saw the smoke and reported it immediately to the local police. The police officers had a hard time to wake us up, including Pepita. When they were at the point of breaking the door, I heard them, and we had barely had the time to grab Pepita and to run outside without shoes, including Pepita, and just with our nightgowns on, excluding Pepita. I enclosed a copy of the local newspaper's article about the fire. 3. Father Anglis never asked me to live on campus, and therefore I never had the opportunity of refusing such a request. My understanding is that Father Anglis prefers teachers to live off campus. By the way, the first and immediate financial help which I received after the fire came from Father Anglis. I hope...
May I respond to that?
Let me just finish it.
Detail.
I hope that the above makes abundantly clear the fact that the statements of Mr. Thomas Case are absolute lies and doubtlessly malicious, since I have never been contacted by Mr. Thomas Case. Should he be interested in a personal interview, please let him know that Mrs. Eleanor Chavez, Miss Talia Reyna Chavez, and Pepita, my Siamese cat, are at his full disposal. And I wonder if perhaps Mr. Case would like to make a public apology to Father Anglis, because I'm sure the unmistakable tone of his article was that that fire had something to do with Father Anglis, and it was used to terrorize people. There wasn't a word of truth in the whole thing. And I could deal with about another 6 points in this article in the same way.
Let's try this one
I
first.
do want to say this really is irrelevant to the point, but since some of them brought it up, I'd like Mr. Case to respond. Please.
Okay, the point is not what Mrs. Chavez thinks now. The point is what the people in the town thought had happened and wrote threatening letters indicating some spiritual or mystical power of people who crossed Father Anglis. This is to indicate the spiritual malaise that is happening around that town. It is a town that is divided and riven by fear.
No, the point is, every word you wrote there is totally untrue. That's what the point is. And you're not... And you attack the reputation of a Catholic priest, Father Anglis, you might disagree with. I'd probably disagree with lots of things with Father Anglis. But you have got no right. No journalist has a right to attack people like that without checking up on the facts.
I'd much rather return to the explicit doctrine in dispute. So I'll ask Jim Sullivan to ask his second question.
Is Mike Jones here?
Pardon?
Mike Jones, he's here? Mike?
Yeah.
Okay.
Speak right into it.
Right. I had a question for Mr. Jones. In doing a little research on schism, I uncovered some remarks by Isidore of Seville, where he says that schism involves a sinful breach of church communion. It delights in the division of the congregation. Its posture is often a Puritan or rigorous separatism, embraced to escape the contagion of the unclean. Now, I think this question has to be asked, as difficult as it may be, and I would simply advert just before the question to Christopher Dawson, who, when he was speaking about the Reformation in England, the refusal to bend to Peter then, in the 16th century, said that we never have heresy and probably schism except that we don't have other aspects mixed up with it, like historical ones and psychological ones. And I think we ought to lay out on the table this question. What is it within the Society of St. Pius and within this whole Lefebvre movement that gives it a certain psychological tone? I think this has to be discussed to some extent. What is it about the members? Is there some sort of absolute inability to somehow move with the magisterium into the present age, and this deep desire to hide behind the rotchet, to move in a kind of romantic movement away from modernity altogether, and Peter?
No, I don't. I think that there are aspects of that involved in this. I think that there are people who want to hold on to something, and one of the biggest recruiting cards that Lefebvrites have had has been the Tridentine Mass. People remember it from before the council. People, there's an attraction to it, and I think the Pope was trying to meet this legitimate attraction when he mentioned the liberalization of the Tridentine Mass during Ecclesia Dei. Okay, but the point here is we've got a situation where in a sense, I see an uncanny succumbing to the very thing that they're objecting to here. I mean, I mentioned this thing with this liberalism thing, but I'm not the only one who mentioned it. I mean, Cardinal Ratzinger mentioned it to Archbishop Lefebvre. I mean, he noticed it too. It's people who say, I want it, we want it our way. It's like the customer is right here. And we're not going to go along with the church because we know what is right and we're sticking with it. So in a sense, I think it's an uncanny sort of reconfirmation of liberalism. But the point here too is that I get this kind of schizophrenic sense here. Mr. Davies is quoting authorities in the church. He's quoting Archbishop Lara. Cardinal Lara. Do you think that Cardinal Lara feels that the society is in schism?
Yes, he does.
Well, then what's the big discussion about then? He feels that he's in schism. I mean, Ratzinger feels he's in schism. We're quoting all these people as if there's no other source of information other than the little snippet that Mr. Davis is giving us, when they've all pronounced on this thing. Now, the bigger question here is, we all agree that the Pope said that Archbishop Lefebvre, what Archbishop Lefebvre did was a schismatic act. We all agree to that, don't we? Oh, wait a minute. Okay, so we don't all agree. He did say it, okay, even if you don't agree with it, he said it, okay? But the question I put to Mr. Davis is, was the Pope wrong when he said that that was a schismatic act? And if that's true, what does that say about the authority of popes?
Michael?
Yes.
But I just want to bring things back to what exactly I said again, which again, if you buy the tape, I hope Howard's listening to this, he might give me a kickback or something on this. If you all buy the tapes. I was addressing one specific question. Does consecrating a bishop without a papal mandate constitute a schismatic act? Cardinal Lara, who does, I presume every cardinal you ask will say they believe Archbishop Lefebvre is in a state of schism. I mean, they're kind of organization men, aren't they? They'd have to say it. But leave that aside. Cardinal Lara, apart from the Pope, is the highest authority for interpreting the Code of Canon Law, and he says that the Code of Canon Law does not say that consecrating a bishop without a papal mandate is a schismatic act, and he also even went on to cite the case of this Vietnamese archbishop.
But he said that Took was non-compos mentis in that case. He said that in the letter. And he also said in the same letter that Lefebvre was in schism.
Yeah, I agree. He thinks Lefebvre was in schism. I'm not talking about whether... No, the question... Question one about the Pope. Yes, if the Pope says Archbishop Lefebvre is in schism, I think the Pope is wrong. Right, I'm happy to say that. Question two... The point I was making was does Cardinal Lara think Archbishop Lefebvre is in a state of schism? The question I asked was, does Cardinal Lara, who has the authority to interpret the Code of Canon Law, agree with you, or does he agree with me that consecrating a bishop without a papal mandate is not a schismatic act? And he agrees with me.
Okay, Dr. Jones.
He agrees with me in that he feels that Archbishop Lefebvre is in schism. He said that in the same letter at another point, okay? The whole point here, I mean, I suppose we could go on all night, Maybe you feel like going on all night. I don't feel like going on all night. But we've at least reached some sort of agreement, okay? The Pope has said that Archbishop Lefebvre has committed a schismatic act. Now, Mr. Davies thinks he's wrong. The Pope says it's schismatic. Mr. Davies thinks he's wrong. I agree with the Pope. I don't know what else there is to say. What else?
It is very late. We have one more question from Chris Ferrara. I'd like to intervene. It's not my office really to intervene, but I have a comment which I just throw out, and it probably will be too complicated to resolve now, but I'd like to add a new consideration, and I think it will somehow synthesize what seem to be irreconcilable views. There's such a thing as a papal act, such that the Pope says, I hereby, using my supreme office, hereby excommunicate you. And having supreme jurisdiction in the church, that papal act need not appeal to any canon law. You can simply say, it's my will. Later on, people can say whether it was an arbitrary act or not, whether he was sinful or prudent or anything, but there is no appeal from a papal act. But I think we ought to note this. Pope John Paul II did not say, I, as Supreme Pontiff, excommunicate you, Marcel Lefebvre. He said, I inform you, Monsignor Lefebvre, that canon law excommunicates you, which is a huge difference, because then it is resolved, is the Pope following consistently the very code of canon law he promulgated? Davies says no. Yes, please.
The code of canon law cannot do anything. It can't excommunicate anyone. It can't put stamps on letters. It can't do anything, okay? The Pope excommunicated Archbishop Lefebvre in accord with canon law, okay? The power resides with the Pope. It doesn't reside with the code of canon law.
I absolutely, I'm going to ask Mike, I absolutely reject that point, because what do you mean by the Latin phrase late sententiae, except that the code itself automatically excommunicates?
This actually is a matter of fact. It's not, there's no point in arguing about something that is a matter of fact. And it is a matter of fact the Pope has never excommunicated Archbishop Lefebvre. You read the admonition sent to him, I can read it to you again if you like, that said if he consecrated the bishops, he would automatically incur ipso facto late sententiae excommunication under Canon 1382. When he done it, they said you have automatically incurred ipso facto late sententiae excommunication under Canon 1382. Then they made that little addition plus schism under 1364. The Pope has never excommunicated Archbishop Lefebvre, and the examples I gave to you, by the way, when I was quoting the cases when a sentence does not apply, that applies specifically to these automatic late sententiae excommunications. It would have been a different matter if the Pope had actually excommunicated him formally like that. He just incurred a penalty, and I gave you the quotations with the Code of Canon Law. You can hear them again when you listen to the tape. You hear that, Howard? When you buy the tape and hear it again, you will hear that's exactly what I said, and they mean that they state quite clearly if these conditions are operative, no penalty applies.
Okay. Now, I'm going to allow sum-ups by people, but I want, first of all, Chris Ferrara to ask his second question, then we'll have some sort of a summary. Chris?
This is for Mr. Davies. I'm sorry, Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, Mr. Davies told us, and you haven't denied, about the formal excommunication pronounced upon St. Athanasius, which proved to be erroneous. That was not a self-executing excommunication under a code of canon law, but a formal pontifical pronouncement which proved to be in error. So my question to you is simply this. If a formal papal pronouncement of excommunication has been proven by history to be in error, isn't that all the more true of an automatic self-executing excommunication under the Code of Canon Law as interpreted by the Pope? In other words, if a formal pronouncement of excommunication has proven to be erroneous, how about a papal interpretation a self-executing canon.
So you're saying
Couldn't that
papal
also be erroneous?
Papal statements are not trustworthy then?
No, Mr. Jones.
That's exactly
Mr. Jones,
what you're saying.
My question is.
No, that's exactly what you're saying.
My question is, if a formal pronouncement.
First of all, let me answer this.
John,
let
me ask the question.
Okay.
Because you haven't answered it. The question is, if a formal pronouncement of excommunication has been proven to be erroneous because it does not carry the note of infallibility, it's not a solemn definition, isn't it a fortiori the case that the Pope's mere interpretation of a canon which is self-executing could also prove to be erroneous? And isn't that Mr. Davies' entire point?
First of all, the case of Liberius and Athanasius is not the case at hand. Secondly,
it's an even stronger case.
Secondly, if you read the Catholic Encyclopedia, you'll get a completely different interpretation than the one Mr. Davies gives. Okay? Thirdly, I'm beginning to hear Charles Curran here. I'm beginning to hear Charles Curran. We can dissent from non-infallible positions of that the Church takes. I'm beginning to hear Charles Curran. I heard Dan McGuire, and now I'm hearing Charles Curran.
No, we can admit the possibility of error is all I'm saying.
Well, what are you saying then? That no pope after Liberius can make any statement that is trustworthy because this one proved not to be trustworthy.
No, I'm saying a pope can err and has erred in the matter of excommunication.
First of all, that has not been shown to be the case with Liberius. Secondly, it has what relevance does it have unless you're going to discredit all papal statements? And if you're going to discredit all non-infallible papal statements, that sounds like Charles Curran.
By the way, this is, it's now 9:20. In the name of humanity, we're all sweltering here. Let Michael have 5 minutes of summary. Then Dr. Jones will have the last word, 5 minutes of summary. And then we can informally mix because some people have a long trip, like 400 miles or so tonight. So, Michael?
Just a quick comment on Liberius. If anyone wants to get the facts of Liberius, I've actually written a long, expanded version of my pamphlet on the life of St. Athanasius, giving all the details of the fall of Pope Liberius, which is accepted by every modern 20th century Catholic scholar, with the exception of the Catholic Encyclopedia. And they don't deny it. They said it isn't certain. You get the Addison Arnold's Catholic Dictionary, you get the Dictionnaire de Théologie Catholique, which has the longest, most scholarly study of it I think that's ever been made. You get the New Catholic Encyclopedia, 1967, a Catholic Dictionary of Theology in Great Britain. Every one of them agrees with Cardinal Newman that Liberius excommunicated Athanasius and signed a formula of dubious orthodoxy. There's no doubt about that at all. But since then, there have been countless unjust papal excommunications. Now, if you read the theological commentaries, they all make the point that excommunications do not carry the note of infallibility. Popes have done them for purely personal reasons. Now, Dr. Jones says, can the Pope write something and we mistrust it? Well, look at Pope John the 22nd. He denied the particular judgment. He said there was no particular judgment after death. He was accused of heresy, terrible thing to do, apparently this would be a systematic act, by the faculty at the University of Paris, the Franciscans. He had to set up a commission to look into it. They found that the University of Paris was right and he was wrong, and he had to retract it. When a pope makes a statement on theology or gives an opinion on canon law, unless he's making a solemn pronouncement, there is the possibility that he could be wrong. Again, that's a theological fact. So basically we're supposed to sum up, and I'm sure you all are very anxious to go, so we'll make it very, very brief, which is, I think the Church is in a state of crisis or emergency throughout the whole of the Western world. I think it is viable Catholicism is disappearing. I'm not setting myself up to judge who is a Catholic and who isn't a Catholic. Do as Bill Maris said. Read these 2 articles applied to the papist priest. He says exactly what I'm saying. And he says, when we turn to Rome, what happens? We ask for bread and we're given stones. Professor James Hitchcock says, today, if we appeal to the Pope to take action against the revolutionaries in the church, it's like appealing to a monarch to whom we are loyal, and then finding that monarch is actually rather fond of revolutionaries. And so nothing is done. Oh, perhaps Dr. Hitchcock is schismatic. So what I'm saying is, in response to the most serious crisis in the church since the Arian heresy, Archbishop Lefebvre, just as St. Athanasius did, has got to go outside the normal structures of canon law in order to help preserve a remnant of faithful, truly Orthodox Catholics, so that when eventually we get a Pope who is willing to take action to cleanse the stables, to get rid of people like Weaklin and Hanthausen, even if it does cause a de jure schism as well as the de facto schism which Father Kenneth Baker admits exists. When a Pope comes to do that, there will be groups of true Orthodox traditionalist Catholics ready to give him their support. Actually, Father Scott, who is the superior of the Pius X in the United States, said that we count ourselves really as reserve troops. We're ready at hand for when the moment comes to serve the Pope. I love the Pope. I pray for him. All the priests of the Society of St. Pius X pray for him by name in the Mass every day. I'm sure that he gets more prayers from them than probably any religious order in the United States. And as I said, we'll have to wait for history to judge. But when I think the verdict of history appears, it is going to be that Archbishop Lefebvre was the second Athanasius, and for people like myself who had the honor of meeting him, we feel we've met a saint. It's been a privilege. Even people who reject him, like Mr. Case and Dr. Jones, they will have reason to rejoice for what he's done for them. We've all benefited from him. Thank God for him. That's what I say.
Well, we all love the Pope, don't we? Except when he says something we don't like. Right? Right? Except when he says something against Archbishop Lefebvre. And then we still love him, right?
Even when he's wrong.
And not only that, not only do we love him, we pray for him. Isn't that white of us? The only thing we don't do is obey him. That's all. Do you know what they call this? Do you know what they call this, folks? Cheap grace. Listen, I love the Pope too. It's like the articles that were in the newspaper, you know? We all love the Pope. It's just that we don't agree with him on abortion or contraception or anything else that's going to gore our ox. How is this any different, folks?
Good God.
How is this any different?
That's absurd.
How is this any different? History will judge, Mr. Davis said. But you're not going to be around to write the history. You'll be judged. We will all be judged. And when we stand before the judgment seat of God, what are we going to say? I stood with the Pope. Or I stood with Archbishop Lefebvre. Because there's no standing with both of them. It's one or the other. Where are you going to stand? Thank you.